Okay, as far as what format for the short answer questions, um, I sentences. I guess I should say that. Make sure that you write incomplete sentences. I did have somebody over the summer that just kept putting in bullet points, and it's like, it's just a big list, you know? So it can't be a big list because I'm asking you if something's a success or a failure. And if you just put a list of successes and list of failures, then you haven't explained why necessarily they are successes or failures. So you'll want to, you know, explain your position and then use specific examples to help prove your position. I did put a sample answer in the course document section. Kind of shows how I would like for you to go about it. Doesn't mean you have to do it exactly the same way. However, if you don't have specific examples, it's not going to go, you know, you won't get the grade that you want. So, and I'll remind you that you can turn them all in on the 18th, or you can turn them in earlier if you would like. If I were you, I would try to turn in one a week just so that you don't wait till the very end to have everything due. But that is your prerogative because you know what your schedule is and you know how busy you are. So, you know, it may be that this week you're incredibly busy, so you can't do anything. But next week you've got Monday off and you're going to have extra time. So maybe next week you do 2 questions. So just do it however your schedule seems to work. Oh, as far as, oh my goodness, because somebody had asked before about being able to hear, that sort of thing. I really only had 1 or 2 of you say that there are issues with audio. Maybe I should be typing this. Should I be typing this? Okay, so maybe, I hate to give you the low tech answer, but you know what I'm gonna say. Log off and log back on. I know that I've had trouble occasionally as a participant in a Zoom meeting, and that's what I've had to do. Or find it, you know, sometimes there's a little mute buttons, you know, check the volume, that sort of thing. I know the person that can't hear me say that. So sorry, person who can't hear me. But I don't know. I will say that the person that can't hear me doesn't have like a volume thing, like a microphone thing next to his name. So I don't know. Oh, he's trying again. All right. But if any of you have any suggestions, feel free to type them in and I will go ahead and we will look back at the notes and the question for the day and talk about maybe good ways to answer that. So, all right. So we were pretty close to the end of the notes, so we'll just kind of wrap that up. Oh, goodness, I put all 4 pages at the same time. Sorry. So, we did not talk about Grant and his presidency, and Grant gets elected. You know why Grant gets elected. He was the hero of the Civil War for the North, so he's very popular. People seem to think he's an honorable, respectable type person, which I think historically is generally true. I know nobody's perfect. I'm well aware that he had issues before the Civil War with drinking, that sort of thing. Seemed to work through those. I also know that his casualty numbers were very high when he fought, but also they did send him to the most contested battles. So, I mean, there may be things that skew that. I don't know. I'm not a very good military historian, but I do know that in the more recent revision, it was, oh, it's David McCullough. That's the name of the guy, I think, who wrote the most recent bio of Grant. But people who've been writing about Grant lately have talked about how he was a better tactician than he's typically given credit for. He was not a good student. He did graduate kind of low in his class at West Point, but you know, so did Patton. But Robert E. Lee was higher up. I know that he was. But what was that guy's name? McClellan, who graduated first in his class the same year as Robert E. Lee. And he was terrible. I mean, Lincoln fired him. He was in charge of the Northern Army for quite a while. So anyway, back to Grant business. So Grant is going to get elected and then reelected. And the book will chronicle lots of the controversies that occur during his presidency. There's a bribery scandal where I think it's Thomas Belknap is Grant's personal secretary, and companies, it's a little early for corporations, but companies bribe him to get access to commerce on Native American reservations. So to go through the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, you would have to do that to be able to sell stuff on Native American reservations and also buy stuff there. So they would bribe the president's personal secretary to get access to those contracts. And the biggest scandal was the Credit Mobilier. They write books about that. If you like finance and scandal and stuff like that, you could read a book about that. But Credit Mobilier is, excuse me, Congress was giving out contracts to build railroads in the West. I mean, clearly Transcontinental Railroad has already been built by this time period, but there's still many more national railroads that are being built in the West. So these contracts provide right-of-way land, so the land on either side of the railroad, which is, you know, anywhere from 1 mile to 2 miles on either side. So you can sell that land, and that land is sometimes pretty valuable, especially if it's near larger cities. And businesses will buy it so they can be near railroad stops. So, sorry, something in my eye. Congress was giving out these contracts to build the railroads. So the railroad companies who won the contract would give really low interest loans, and they would have to pay them back over a very long period of time. And they would get access to that right-of-way land. So congressmen understood this was pretty lucrative. So what they did was they formed fake holding companies. They made up fake corporations and bid on the contracts and then awarded the contracts to themselves. Now, this is an era where very few things are illegal, very few things like that are illegal. That was. So they did the one thing that was illegal, and they end up getting caught. And it turns out to be several important congressmen, and people who are tied into the Grant administration. So, but Grant, there's no indication Grant's personally involved in any of this, but apparently he's picked some bad folks, or some bad folks, or some nice folks took advantage of opportunities and did some bad things. You can judge them however you like. But there's several scandals during the Grant administration. None that directly involve Grant. No indication that Grant himself is a terribly dishonest fellow, but he's not giving strong oversight during his presidency. Stuff you'll probably want to note during his presidencies. At the beginning, Grant is pretty assertive about using the Enforcement Acts or the Force Acts or the KKK Acts to send troops to states where governors request them to protect African American voters. Toward the end of the second presidency, he just pretty much tells them they're on their own. So as time goes along, Republicans are less and less committed to enforcing protections put in place during Reconstruction. And then you'll notice the Supreme Court is also less and less interested in enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments. So over time, the zeal to protect African American voters who are more likely to vote Republican in the South declined. And if you're wondering why is that, probably a couple of reasons. And your book will talk about this as well. Reason number one, the people who were seriously committed to abolition are either no longer in government or dead. So the people who really pushed for equality for African Americans, who had some power in the Republican governments in the North, are no longer involved in the Republican governments in the North. Thing number two, the Gilded Age has started. So companies are expanding pretty rapidly. There's a whole lot of money floating around. So both parties, Democrats and Republicans, become pretty focused on how they can capitalize on the wealth that is being created, either through campaign contributions or honestly just through direct bribery. So there's all sorts of corruption that occurs in the era after Reconstruction that is really directly related to the amazing amount of capital that's created during this era. This is the era right after Reconstruction, the era called the Gilded Age, where the United States economy expands so rapidly that they become, an international power in trade, and I am part of the United States. I wasn't alive back then, but also we get enough money that we start collecting more taxes, so we build up the military. So it's going to lead us to become a military power as well. So the creation of wealth during this time period really takes attention away from, civil rights and equality. So both parties become much more interested in money than they are civil rights. So there you go. And southern states had already started to put in restrictions. I mean, they did that very quickly to limit the civil rights of former slaves. And the federal government at this point, either the executive branch or the judicial branch, really, they don't have an interest in making sure the South does what they're supposed to do. And they'll even say in the slaughterhouse cases that the 14th and 15th Amendments really don't apply to state activities, only to federal activities, which is an amazing thing, for them to say. But it's also a sign to you that the Supreme Court is still very pro-South or conservative, and maybe not very supportive of the 14th and 15th Amendments. And if you're wondering, is that possible for the Supreme Court to be that way? Sure. I mean, we like to think the Supreme Court isn't political, but they are appointed by politicians. They have political views. So, you have a bunch of holdovers on the Supreme Court during this era from the pre-Civil War era, and that's how they think. So, and that happens sometimes where the Supreme Court, because they are lifetime appointees, their thought processes are very similar to a past generation because they've been there a long time. They're old folks. Now, that does not mean, I know what you're thinking, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she's old, but she's very forward-thinking. You're correct. And there are times that the Supreme Court is very forward-thinking, much more so than the president or the Congress. And we'll see that in U.S. history as well. And sometimes we'll look at that and go like, hey, I like that. And some of you will look at that and go like, well, I like their ideas. However, they're making law, not interpreting it. So it's a little controversial, perhaps. All right, so Grant, couple of terms, a lot of corruption, less protection of civil rights over time because there's more concern about money. Grant, I think I mentioned in a previous lecture, Grant is not well. He has cancer and is dying. Now, cancer treatment during that time period, there wouldn't be any really. They do some surgeries. I don't know if that's a good idea in 1876. They do some surgeries and sometimes have success. It's Cleveland, I think. Is it Grover Cleveland? I know you guys are going like, why is she asking us? Who goes offshore and has surgery on a ship so nobody will know who it is. I think it is Grover. I think so, in his second term. And the surgery is successful, but that's pretty rare. So there's not going to be a good treatment for Grant. If you're wondering, why does he have cancer? He smoked too much and drank too much. He ended up with throat cancer. And, even esophageal cancer, throat cancer, those things, even in the modern era, are really hard to overcome. So he knew he was dying. His plan was to write his memoirs so he could sell them and his family would be able to survive without his income. So he was a little bit younger and had younger family. So he's distracted, rightfully so. Other politicians are distracted by money, and we have an election, excuse me, in 1876, and the election is, sorry, letting people in. The election in 1876, the Democrat is Samuel J. Tilden. I don't know why middle initials are so important, but they are. And the Republican is Rutherford B. Hayes. And neither of these guys are bad dudes. They're fine. Nobody seems to dislike either of them personally. However, the parties are incredibly corrupt during this era. I'll also mention this 8 million times, but the parties really control politics during this era, and they control the presidential nominees and eventually the president. So parties have a lot of power in this era, and companies have a lot of power over the parties because they're buying influence. So, and there aren't really any rules about campaign contributions or bribes during this time period. So this upcoming time period is the reason we invent rules. So they're like, you know, the oldest sibling in the family, the reason the rest of us got rules, because, you know, number one, it's always doing stuff. So the Gilded Age is the era where we do all kinds of stuff we probably shouldn't do, so we create rules in the future to prevent that sort of stuff. So all sorts of corruption between the Democrats and the Republicans, and the Republicans figure out the vote's really close at the end of the election. And the Republicans figure out if Rutherford B. Hayes wins in 3 states, if he can win the popular vote there, he'll lose the popular vote overall, but win the electoral vote. And that happens from time to time. You've noticed it at least once recently, if you're a little older, twice, with Clinton and Trump, and then with Bush and Gore in 2000. And it happens, and typically it's legitimate, just a quirk of the system. Tilden and Hayes' situation, probably not legitimate. So the Republicans figured out that if they wanted 3 states, I think it was, oh, I always get them wrong, Florida, of course, South Carolina, and maybe Illinois or Pennsylvania, I can't remember. But so there's 3 states. The Republicans send people there to help with the recount, and then magically Hayes wins all those states. Well, then the Democrats are like, hey, we're going to help with the recount. So they send people there, and votes between the 2 different recounts, which are controlled by the 2 different parties, votes disappear. There's accusations of fraud. It's a terrible mess. So, oh crud, what are you going to do? So what they decide to do, they talk about doing the constitutional thing, amazing, which is to let the House of Representatives vote, because that is what the Constitution says. If there's a dispute in the Electoral College, then the election goes to the House of Representatives, because that's the most representative part of our government. You know, it's by population. Well, the South didn't think that was fair because their governments hadn't been reconstructed and their voices wouldn't be completely heard. So they protested, and South Carolina said, if this is what happens, we're going to secede again, and it's a huge mess. So what the House of Representatives decides is, we don't want to deal with this, so we're going to make a commission, and it'll be 15 people, 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent, and they will decide who the president is. And you can already tell that means one guy is going to decide who the president is. And then that guy's off the committee. He gets replaced by a Republican. They vote 8-7 that the Republican should become the president. And then chaos ensues and more threats of secession. And then they come up with this thing, the bargain of 1877, or sometimes called the Compromise of 1877. Now, I'm going to strongly suggest to you, are you paying attention? I'm strongly suggesting something to you. That when you write your answer to the weekly question about is Reconstruction successful or not, you need to mention this in there, because this is why Reconstruction ends. This has to show up somewhere in your answer. If it doesn't, you know what I'll know? You don't pay attention to me when I'm talking to you. This really needs to show up at some point in your answer, probably toward the end, since it's the end of Reconstruction. Okay, so bargain of 1877. What that committee decides is this. The North or the Republicans will get the presidency. So Rutherford B. Hayes will become president. They'll nickname him Rutherford B. Hayes, so good for him. And you won't know anything about his presidency because no one cares about it. Okay, so Hayes gets to be president. The South will get a cabinet member. I think the one that they got was Postmaster General, which, I mean, even now, from time to time, the post office becomes really important. But in the old days, when that's, the only way you could get stuff, the post office was super important, although I would never suggest to you that the Postmaster General was the most important cabinet member. Probably not, but anyway. So the South gets a cabinet member, the presidential advisor, but of course the president could just ignore them. The South is going to get a railroad from Texas to California. And you're thinking, well, do we really care? Yeah, a little. I mean, that's important for commerce. And the Transcontinental Railroad route was northern. So it went through Chicago and then some old states up north and the promontory point, Utah, which is a little farther north, is kind of the middle of that. And then it ends up in Northern California. Yeah, Northern California. Okay. So this will help commerce in the South, the Southwest, essentially. So it's kind of important, but the thing with the capital letters is the most important. It's the end of military reconstruction. So what that means is Southern states get to be themselves again. So they're no longer 5 military districts. They no longer have the 5 military governors. They can just do whatever they want, kind of, sort of. They can have their elections again. They can send people back to DC that don't have to be approved in, their electoral processes don't have to be approved. And they also, the troops are gone. So in the rare instance, I mean, it did get more rare as Reconstruction went along, that there were troops there to protect African-American voters. Now they're gone. And you will not see any significant African-American election participation after 1876 until, probably the 1968 election. So not quite 100 years, but about 90. So for the next 90 years, you really aren't going to see any significant Black voter participation in the South. And that is in large part because of the bargain of 1877, which ends military reconstruction. So I'm going to say it again. If I were you, I would talk about this in my answer to the weekly question. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop sharing for just a second. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is talk about the weekly question. Woohoo. But do you guys have any questions before we talk about the weekly question? Is there anything you want to ask? I'm also going to go over how you get grades in this class one more time, just for fun. All right, fine. No questions, that's fine. Okay, so how do you get grades in this class? Reminder, well, I guess I remind you each class. I'll stop reminding you at a certain point, but I keep getting emails about it. So, all right, now, anytime you forget this stuff, the syllabus, because I'm getting stuff like, when is stuff due? There's a calendar in the syllabus, like 3rd page or so. Just scroll down and you'll see the calendar. All the due dates for the whole semester are already there. So, and you haven't asked yet, but I know you're going to, because, it's the way people are. Your stuff is due on Fridays, typically. Your book review is due on a Monday, but your stuff is typically due on Fridays, midnight. It's really 11:59 is your official due date. Now, the way that I've set it up, you can still turn in stuff after that. It'll just tell you that it's late, so don't be offended by it. Even if you turn it in at 12:01, it's going to say that it's late. Now, I will notice the difference between you turning it in at 12:01 and you turning it in 3 days later. I promise you, I'll notice the difference. And you can always send me an email that explains why it's late, but if it's a minute or two late, I'm not going to care. Now, you know, again, if I were you, I wouldn't wait till midnight to try to turn stuff in. Because you know, you've been in school long enough, you know, stuff always breaks then, the internet goes out. In the old days, the printer would stop working or the hammer and chisel would break or something. Okay, so stuff's due midnight, 11:59 on the due date that's listed in the syllabus, okay? And I think the due date also is pretty apparent on the assignments page. You turn in all the stuff on the assignments page of Blackboard. When you turn stuff in, it's also going to do one of those plagiarism check things. So if you copy and paste it from a source, it'll tell me. Now also, I've taught long enough that if you copy and paste it from a source, I would notice anyway, because it would sound like a source, you know, it wouldn't sound like you. Not that you aren't a source, but you know what I'm saying. I'm not always bad to quote things, but you know, especially on the weekly questions, there's not much reason to. You're just answering the question. So my assumption is you're using the textbook to answer the question, and I'm basing the questions on material that you can find in the textbook. So my expectation is that you will use the textbook as your main source to answer the questions. You will also notice maybe that when I lecture about stuff, I'm lecturing from material that is available in your chapter. So all of these things should go together. So you should not have to be doing a lot of independent research as long as you are reading your textbook. That's the expectation. Your textbook is the source of your information, and you'll use that to answer questions. Okay. Oh, questions. All right. Okay. Yeah, everything is due on the 18th, all 3 of the weekly questions, and this Friday is not the 18th. Yeah, so so it's 2 or 3 weeks, 2 weeks, I don't know. Today is the 3rd, so tomorrow's the 4th, so yep, 2 more weeks. So the 18th, and you can turn stuff in, weekly questions individually, or you can turn them all in on the same day, but they're listed as 3 separate assignments. And you'll notice that if you go to the assignments. You will also have a quiz over each unit, okay? And so the quiz will be 8 to 10 multiple choice questions. And on the quiz, I'll give you some clues to help you figure out what to study. I posted those yesterday, and there's something like review for timed questions. So the timed questions, the quiz is timed. So I'll put in the questions and you'll have a certain amount of time. Now, it's not going to kick you out if you go over that time. It is going to tell me that you went over that time, and it's going to tell me how much time you took. Okay. All right. Are you guys typing other questions? So all 3 of the weekly questions are technically due on the 18th, yes, but you can turn them in whenever you like before the 18th. After the 18th, you could still turn them in. I'm just going to count them late. The quiz, when I post it, I haven't posted the quiz yet. I'll make it available on the 16th, so you'll have that Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday to take the quiz. My expectation on the quiz is that you take it all at the same time. So not that you look at it and then you go away and you look up all the answers and come back. My expectation is you do the quiz in one sitting and you don't use resources other than your brain while you take the quiz, okay? Part of the reason it's timed is I don't want you to have time to look up every question. These are things you should know. And how should you know them? I don't know. You listened to me talk about them, you read the textbook about them, and you looked at the list of stuff I told you to study, okay? This should not be super hard. It really shouldn't. That's not necessarily my goal, okay? Now, I'll give you probably a survey after the first quiz just to see what you thought about it. As far as grades, you know, it's college, so we don't expect everyone to pass. We don't expect everyone to get an A. You know, it's not high school where we expect everyone to pass and most people to get A's and B's. But I know that you would all like to pass and have an A, so I'm not trying to be disrespectful to you in any way. But a range of grades is something I would expect. So for me, like on the first quiz, if every single one of you gets 100, I've made the quiz too easy. Now you won't object, I understand that, and I won't go back and change your grade or anything, but it would be assigned to me that I probably need to make the next quiz a little more challenging. Now, if you all pass, I'm probably fine with that. I mean, I don't want anybody to flunk. My boss has an expectation that a certain number of people will not pass, and that typically is true, but it's usually not because the class is too hard. It's because your life got complicated and you didn't have time for stuff, so yeah, stuff happens. So after the first quiz, I'll do a little survey, and I'll also look at the grade distribution, which will also tell me some stuff that I probably need to know. All right, so quiz with each unit. So every 3 or 4 weeks a quiz, and then one question per chapter that's like an essay question. So you type out your answer. And I'm sure I've already said this. My expectation at the very least is that your answer is longer than my question, and that it's typically about a page long for the answer. You know the question ahead of time, so I mean, you know, you might as well put a lot of information in. All right, ready to talk about the weekly question? I'm gonna go with a yes. Is there anything else you want to ask before we move to it? All right, sharing the screen then. Weekly question, weekly question. All right, so here we go, weekly question. Here it is. Is that big enough? You can see that, right? Okay. Was Reconstruction a success or a failure? Or was it something in between? And usually when you get a question like this in a history class, because it's not math, it's not physics, you know, 4 plus 4 typically is 8. However, Reconstruction is success or failure, it's, yeah. So typically when you get a question like this, the answer is going to be something in between. You do not have to answer that way. I mean, you may answer another way and be able to persuasively argue your response. Consider land policy, key legislation during presidential and radical Reconstruction, Southern politics, racial and political violence, Northern fatigue, which is the Grant era with Reconstruction. Be sure to make clear what you mean by success and failure. Okay, guys are typing questions. Let me look. The quiz. There's one quiz over each unit. So the first quiz is over, it's like Olivia's telling you. The first quiz is over 15, 16, and 17. The next quiz will be over 18, 19, 20, 21. Also, I'm gonna just mention this again. All of that stuff is in the syllabus, and all of that stuff is in the section where the calendar is. So it will tell you when each quiz is, when the weekly questions are due, and it'll tell you what chapters are in each unit. So all of that stuff, I promise you, is in the syllabus. Promise. So look in the section where the calendars are, kind of in the middle, okay? But I mean, you can ask. I'm just going to remind you that all that stuff's in the syllabus. And the cool thing about college is all that stuff has to be in the syllabus. It's like the blueprint of the class. I was going to say the Bible, but that probably doesn't fit well. It's like the blueprint of the class. So we're required to tell you all the due dates up front, and changing the syllabus is like a big no-no in a college class where, you know, when you teach high school, which I did for eternity, everything changes every day, especially this year. Okay. All right, so always check the syllabus for stuff. No, there are not essay questions in addition to the weekly questions. It is possible that I could give you a short, I mean, there's no rule, I can do stuff. I could give you a short answer question on a quiz. I did not for this first one. Yeah. A quiz per week, then one big quiz over the, I'm not really sure what you're asking me. There's definitely not a quiz every week. There's a quiz for every unit. There's a question for every chapter. So the way that it breaks down is there's one chapter per week in this class. So one chapter per week. There's one question, weekly question per chapter. So each chapter has one question. And then after 3 or 4 chapters, 3 for the first unit, 3 for the last, 4 for the 2 middle units. So there's 4 units total. After the unit's over, I'm going to give you a quiz with essentially an equal number of questions per chapter. And because the quiz, at least the first one, is really short, it'll be like 3 or 4 questions. If you look in the course documents page, I've already given you a list of things you should probably study for the quiz. Okay. Hopefully all this stuff is making sense. All right, we're going to go back to the weekly question now. Okay. And again, weekly question, you can turn in 1 a week. You can turn them all in on the 18th. Does not matter to me. Okay. All right, so if I'm answering this question, was Reconstruction a success or a failure? You know what I would start with? I'm going like, no, I don't. Tell me what Reconstruction is. So in this answer, I would start with a definition of Reconstruction. So I suppose I should capitalize it. I hate to type in front of you because I'm the worst typist in the world, as you can see. Play piano, but I can't type. All right, so I would start with the definition of Reconstruction. So tell me what it is. What is Reconstruction? When did it happen? So this is like a when and what, you know, just your basic definition. When does it happen? What is it? And then I would start to talk about what happened during Reconstruction. Now, as you talked about what happened during this era or this period, you have different options about how you could organize it. And you really do want to think about your organizational strategy. So do you want to organize this chronologically, like just go in order and talk about the important things that happen? Or do you want to organize it in a different way? I think for this question, and you can do it however you want, because you can do it successfully in a variety of different ways. But I think for this question, I would probably organize it into things that were positive that occurred during Reconstruction and things that were negative that occurred during Reconstruction. That's probably what I would do. Because your question is, was it a success or a failure? And I've already indicated to you that it's probably both. So you probably will want to have a paragraph where you define Reconstruction, then a paragraph where you talk about the successes or failures of Reconstruction, and a paragraph where you talk about the opposite, so successes or failures. You could also just have, you know, one paragraph where you describe the things that happened, and then a paragraph where you talk about which of those things were good, and then a paragraph where you talk about which of those things were not so successful. And it does suggest to you that you want to talk about land policy. So did they redistribute land or not? Did that ever happen? Was it ever successful? The book does talk about that. Key legislation, so laws. Now, if you answer this question and you don't talk about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, to me that's a problem, because we so rarely have amendments. We only have 28 total. We got 10 of them all at once. So if we pass 3 amendments during this era and you don't talk about them, I'm going to think you're not really paying attention. So be sure to mention the amendments. So that's 13 through 15. Now, when you're mentioning these, explain what they are. Because I did have somebody talk about these in the summer class and say, well, they passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. True, but I don't have any evidence that you know what those amendments are. So be sure to explain those amendments at some point. So this has to be more than just a list of stuff that happened. That's why bullet points really are not a good idea in an essay question, because they don't necessarily show anything other than you know some stuff that happened. I don't know if you understand the stuff that happened or if you understand why it was important. So mention the amendments, Civil Rights Act, Freedmen's Bureau. There's a lot of things that you could talk about. Now, to be fair, to write an essay like this, you could go on for like 5 or 6 pages. I'm not suggesting that you should. So you're definitely going to have to limit the amount of stuff that you talk about to keep it, within a page or two. But I don't want it to be a paragraph long. I'm hoping that I'm explaining this well to you, because some of you are still going to turn in an answer that's about the same size as my question, and I'm not going to give you very many points. So all I want is detail. That's all I want. And since you have the question ahead of time, I don't think it's an unreasonable request. Also, since you get 1 question a week, I also think it's probably an okay request. So detail is what we're looking for here, okay? All right. Are you asking a question, somebody? No, just noise. Okay.
So I had a question.
Okay, go ahead, please.
With regard to the land policy, they did give them land in like Carolina. I remember reading about that. Was that during
Right.
Reconstruction?
I would talk about it. I mean, it does kind of happen end of Civil War toward Reconstruction, so it's kind of in that little fuzzy in-between period. But the reason I would mention it is because it was promised, it started to happen, and then it was successful. But
And
then
they took it all back.
Correct, yeah. That's why I would mention it. Also, there's going to be an argument that's a counter argument against doing it that says that African Americans, former slaves, not smart enough to manage their own business, not able to do this properly. But we have evidence that, because it was done, there's definitely evidence that it could work. If you already submitted it, you can resubmit it. That's true. And I haven't graded it yet. So if you want, you can tell me not to grade it, or I can grade it and then you can, yeah. Now, normally I'm not gonna want you to let me grade something and then you get to redo it, okay? But for this one, if you've already turned it in, that's fine. If I grade it before you resubmit, you can just tell me. But as a rule, I just want you to turn stuff in once, okay? But on this one, free pass, I get it. Okay. Now, again, if you talked about every single thing that the chapter mentions, your essay would be super long. So pick the things that you think were most important, or support your argument the best, okay? I would definitely talk about how Congress creates the Freedmen's Bureau, how they add additional funding to that, how there are schools created in the South during this time period that really hadn't been there before. You could talk about colleges. I think this chapter talks about the colleges that show up in the South, but there's also public schools as well. You could talk in general about what the Freedmen's Bureau does. You could talk about how African Americans during this period run for office, get elected to office, mention the names of a couple of folks because your book does talk about them by name. Where it says racial and political violence, I don't know how you leave the KKK out. I mean, they probably have got to show up in this answer a little bit as a reaction to Reconstruction. And then when you wrap this thing up, you really have to talk about the Compromise of the Bargain of 1877. And I didn't mention it, although it does say, in the answer, the radical Reconstruction, military Reconstruction, those 5 military districts where African American voters are protected by the federal government. So there's a ton of stuff in your chapter to talk about with this question. Your hardest part, I think, is figuring out how to organize it and which of the things to put in. Now, I would probably argue that it was a success in some ways and a failure in others. Some of you are going to argue that it was a complete failure because what was supposed to happen, African Americans becoming free and equal, didn't happen. That's a completely legitimate way to argue. If you argue that, just don't ignore the stuff that did happen that was positive. But I understand that part of your conclusion will be it might have been positive, but it wasn't permanent. And that makes perfect sense. Some of you are going to argue, no, it was a complete success because it created the framework for, you know, a new set of framework for equality. And you're going to probably argue that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were crucial to the cause of equality, which there's no doubt. And you might argue that certain incredibly successful African Americans who really changed the world came out of this period, you know, in part because of opportunities from this period. And I think you could successfully argue that. But most of you will probably go like, yeah, some of it's great and some of it's terrible. So, but honestly, whatever you argue, as long as it makes sense, as long as you've backed it up with some logical conclusion. So some facts from the textbook, and you don't say, well, you know, the Martians intervened, or, you know, you don't make stuff up. So I don't know if that was terribly helpful or not. Do you guys have some questions you would like to ask at this time? Look, should we talk about women? Sure. I mean, there are going to be women in here that you could talk about. You could also talk about how the women's rights movement takes sides on the 15th Amendment. But Sojourner Truth is kind of big during this era in the Freedmen's Bureau. But yeah, I would pick the things from the book that you think are the best pieces of information to help you answer this question. And I don't know, I mean, clearly because the question's about Reconstruction, you know, it's about African Americans. So you're definitely going to talk about African Americans as leaders, African Americans as, you know, people who were successful during Reconstruction. And I think, you know, that makes sense. There aren't going to be probably as many women leaders involved in this. But just talk about the stuff that makes sense as you answer the question, if that helps. I don't know if that helps. And it is tricky on the first one you submit because, you know, you don't know how I grade yet. That's also why I'm suggesting to you that you turn them in one at a time. So that way you can get some feedback on one instead of all three at once, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? All right, you guys have other questions? Oh, yeah, just because it isn't biased, your answer doesn't show bias, that does not mean that you're going to see the positive and negatives as equal. So, I mean, there's times that things just are bad, you know, we'll talk about some of those things in history, and you're not going to be able to find equal stuff. I will go over 16 and 17 as well. Yes, we'll talk about those as well. Yeah. But just because you're talking about positive and negative things doesn't mean there's an equal number of positive as there are negative. And I know, probably if you've had a speech class, you know, there's certain numbers of points you're supposed to give and have a balanced argument. You know, sometimes history is not balanced. Sometimes things are more negative than they are positive. And sometimes you, for whatever reason, just see one side, you know, you see one side is stronger than the other. So as long as you mention some of each, I'm going to be okay with that. And I wouldn't expect your paragraphs to be the same length because, you know, that's not how history works. Sometimes everything's great and sometimes stuff's terrible. And I mean, we can almost always find something good, something positive that goes on, but sometimes you gotta look really hard. This one, I think, is a little more balanced. I mean, if I were to ask you about, I don't know, a war or something like that, wars tend to be negative in the process, but sometimes have positive effects. So, but yeah, I wouldn't expect that the good and bad arguments are the same length or, have the same number of details. No, I got it. Makes sense. All right. Anything else you want to ask? Okay. I know it might be a little early, but before you check out, don't leave. Don't leave just yet, okay? So I want to kind of double check on the roll because I didn't get everybody all at first. So let me kind of double check on that. I know I could take a screenshot, but what I've noticed is that I take a screenshot and then I don't go back and look at it. Isn't that terrible? You guys probably aren't like that. Now, if you're late, you're late. Stuff happens. Right. Oh, goodness. All right. I know I'm squinting at it. I really can't see it. I was at some Zoom meeting the other day, and I guess everybody's old. They all had to take out their reading glasses. I mean, it happens. For some reason, I don't need them yet. I'm old, but I don't need them. Goodness. All right. Almost done. Do you guys have, is there anything you guys want to ask? You could just say it out loud. Dear Creed. That would be cool if you could leave and leave your name up there, wouldn't it? I know. I should take the screenshot. I know. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm almost done. And then I think what I'll probably do is just the people whose names I can't find, I'll just say them out loud here in just a second. And then, or try to say them out loud. Here. Some of you, I'm going to hurt your names. I really feel like I saw Jaden in here.
I'm here.
Yeah, I thought I saw you. Thank you. All right. Almost done, almost done. Okay. You guys really don't have any questions? You got it all? That's good.
Yeah, I'm good, ma'am.
Okay, no, I'm glad that you are. I'm not going to make you have questions. All right, so the people that I didn't think I saw, and it just, I'm older, I can forget stuff, is Bullready, the last name, something like that. I can't. And that's somebody, you already told me what. I'm sorry?
Yeah, just go by Harston. Let's go by Harston, man.
Yeah, I remember that you told me something.
Like,
okay, all right. So I wrote that down and then couldn't read my own handwriting. So I apologize once again for harming your name. And then Creed.
Okay.
The sound is really weird on my end. Is it weird on your end too? Okay. And then the other person is Mike, but I know that he had said he might not be here. So. Okay. All right. Okay, I think that I'm done. Is there anything you want to ask before we go? I know I've asked you that about 5 times. So, oh, and thankfully I recorded myself taking roll. So let me stop the recording.